I never thought I'd be in a standoff with the HOA president over a fishing spot, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The moment I saw Susan Perkins marching down the community dock with that signature clipboard clutched to her chest, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to take a nosedive. My name is Samuel Blackwell, and for the past 15 years, I've lived in Lakeview Estates, a picturesque community nestled along the shores of Lake Monroe in Bloomington, Indiana. When my wife and I purchased our home here, the selling point was the private lake access and the community dock where residents could fish and moor small boats. Every weekend, without fail, I'd be at my favorite spot at the east end of the dock by 6 a.m., fishing rod in hand, thermos of coffee by my side. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwell," Susan called out as her wedge heels clacked against the wooden planks. "We need to discuss your use of this dock area." I sighed, reeling in my line. Susan Perkins had been elected as HOA president just 6 months ago, and already she'd managed to alienate half the neighborhood with her zealous enforcement of rules, some of which seemed to be made up on the spot. "Good morning, Susan," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Beautiful day for fishing." "That may be, but I'm afraid you can't fish here anymore." She adjusted her designer sunglasses and gestured broadly at my setup. "The board has decided to designate this section of the dock as a scenic viewing area. Fishing will now only be permitted on the west end." I blinked, trying to process her words. "Since when? I've been fishing from this exact spot for over a decade." "Since last night's emergency board meeting," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We voted 3-2 in favor of the change. Signs will be posted by Monday, but I wanted to inform you personally since I know you're attached to this spot." The west end of the dock was terrible for fishing. It was shallow, full of weeds, and constantly in the shadow of overhanging trees. Everyone knew the east end, where I was currently situated, was prime fishing territory with clear access to the deeper parts of the lake. "Was there any notice of this emergency meeting?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "It was posted on the community bulletin board," she replied dismissively. "Now, if you could please pack up your things and move to the designated fishing area, I'd appreciate it." I stood my ground. "Susan, I've reviewed our HOA bylaws thoroughly. Any rule change requires a public notice at least 7 days prior to voting, with all homeowners given an opportunity to comment." Her smile faltered. "This was a safety matter, which allows for expedited decision-making per Section 12, Paragraph 3. "A safety matter? What possible safety concern could there be about which end of the dock people fish from?" Susan gestured to my tackle box. "Those hooks are dangerous. A child could get hurt. Plus, the smell of fish attracts wildlife. We've had reports of raccoons in the area." I had to bite my tongue to prevent myself from saying something I'd regret. "Susan, with all due respect, that's ridiculous. No one's been injured in the 15 years I've been fishing here, and raccoons are naturally found around lakes regardless of whether people are fishing." "Nevertheless, the board has made its decision." She tapped her clipboard. "I suggest you comply, or we'll have to consider this a violation subject to fines." As I packed up my gear, fuming silently, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of what would become a neighborhood-wide battle against Susan's increasingly tyrannical rule, or that the fishing spot dispute would eventually expose corruption that would rock our community to its core. The following weekend, I arrived at the dock at my usual time, deliberately setting up in my regular spot. I wasn't typically one to cause trouble, but something about this arbitrary rule change had struck a nerve. Perhaps it was the principle of the matter, or maybe it was the smug satisfaction in Susan's voice when she'd informed me of the change. I'd been fishing for about an hour when I heard the now familiar sound of heels on wood. This time, Susan wasn't alone. She was accompanied by Doug Matthews, the HOA treasurer, a man who seemed to exist solely to nod in agreement with whatever Susan said. "Mr. Blackwell," Susan called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I believe I made it clear last week that fishing is no longer permitted in this area. I took my time reeling in a small base before responding. Good morning, Susan, Doug. Actually, I checked the HOA records. There was no properly noticed emergency meeting, no safety study, and no formal vote recorded in the minutes. So, as far as I can tell, there's no enforceable rule prohibiting fishing from this spot. Doug shifted uncomfortably, but Susan's face reddened. We don't need to document every little decision in the official minutes. The board has discretionary authority. That's not what our bylaws say, I countered, returning my attention to my fishing rod. Article 4, Section 2 states that all board decisions affecting common areas must be documented and made available to homeowners within 48 hours. Are you a lawyer now, Mr. Blackwell? She sneered. No, just a homeowner who reads the documents I signed, I replied calmly. Now, if you'll excuse me, the fish are biting this morning. Susan stepped closer, lowering her voice. This can go one of two ways, Samuel. You can be reasonable and follow the board's directives, or you can be difficult and find yourself facing violations for all sorts of things I'm sure you've overlooked on your property. That was a threat, plain and simple. I met her gaze steadily. Are you threatening me with selective enforcement, Susan? Because that would be a violation of state law regarding HOA governance. Doug tugged at Susan's sleeve. Maybe we should discuss this at the next regular meeting, he suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Susan ignored him. Fine, enjoy your fishing today, Mr. Blackwell, but this isn't over. She turned on her heel and marched back down the dock, Doug trailing behind her like a reluctant puppy. I released the base I'd caught back into the lake, watching it swim away. Something told me I'd just stirred up a hornet's nest, but I couldn't bring myself to regret standing my ground. The following week, I returned home from work to find a violation notice taped to my front door. According to the citation, my garbage cans had been visible from the street on a non-collection day, a violation of community aesthetic standards. The fine was $100. My wife, Angela, was furious when I showed her the notice. This is ridiculous, Sam. Our garbage cans are in the same place they've been for 15 years. I nodded, examining the notice more carefully. Look at this. The inspection was conducted at 7 a.m. on Tuesday. Who's doing inspections at that hour, Susan? Angela said with certainty. She's retaliating because of your fishing spot. I sighed, knowing she was right. I'm going to appeal this. You should talk to some of the neighbors too, Angela suggested. I bet we're not the only ones dealing with Susan's power trips. She was right. A quick survey of our closest neighbors revealed that several had received similar petty violations in recent weeks. Mark and Lisa Johnson had been cited for their garden hose being visible on their front lawn. The Patels had received a warning about their children's bicycles being left in their driveway for more than 3 consecutive hours. The Schmidts had been fined for unauthorized wind chimes. All of these neighbors had something in common. They'd opposed various initiatives Susan had tried to push through since becoming HOA president. It was becoming clear that she was using rule enforcement as a weapon against those who didn't fall in line with her vision for the community. I decided to take action. I created a private Facebook group for Lakeview Estates residents and invited everyone I knew who lived in the community. Within days, over 70% of homeowners had joined, and the stories of selective enforcement and questionable rule changes came pouring in. One post in particular caught my attention. Amanda Thompson, who lived in the cul-de-sac near the community entrance, wrote that she'd seen Susan and Doug having a heated discussion with a man in a suit outside the clubhouse late one evening. When they noticed Amanda walking her dog nearby, they quickly ended their conversation, and the stranger drove away in a luxury car with a logo Amanda didn't recognize. There's something fishy going on, I told Angela as we reviewed the growing list of complaints on the Facebook group. It's not just about my fishing spot or being petty with rule enforcement. I think there's more to this. Like what? She asked. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but I think it's time we got some answers. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening. Usually, these meetings were sparsely attended, maybe 10-15 residents out of the 120 homes in our community. But thanks to our Facebook group, the meeting room at the community clubhouse was packed to capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Susan looked visibly startled when she entered and saw the crowd. She whispered something to Doug before taking her place at the center of the board table. "Good evening," she began, her voice not quite as confident as usual. "I see we have quite a turnout tonight. Let's begin with roll call and approval of last month's minutes." I raised my hand immediately. "Point of order," I called out. "I'd like to propose an amendment to tonight's agenda. Given the unusual attendance, I move that we add an open forum for community concerns before proceeding with regular business." A chorus of "second" erupted from around the room. Susan's smile was strained. "While I appreciate the enthusiasm, we have a full agenda tonight, and the bylaws state that any procedural motion seconded by at least 3 members must be put to an immediate vote," interrupted Richard Garcia, a retired attorney who lived 2 doors down from me. Trapped by her own rulebook, Susan had no choice but to call for a vote. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only Susan, Doug, and 1 other board member voting against it. For the next hour, resident after resident stood up to voice concerns about selective enforcement, lack of transparency, and questionable financial decisions. I noticed Susan becoming increasingly agitated, especially when Amanda Thompson mentioned the mysterious meeting with the suited stranger. "That was a private matter unrelated to HOA business," Susan snapped, "and I'd appreciate it if residents wouldn't spy on board members." "It wasn't spying," Amanda replied calmly. "I was walking my dog on a public sidewalk." "And if it was unrelated to HOA business, why was it held at the clubhouse, which is HOA property?" Susan didn't have a good answer for that. The meeting continued, with more and more discrepancies coming to light. The landscaping contract had been awarded to a company owned by Susan's brother-in-law, a clear conflict of interest. The emergency reserve fund had been depleted by nearly 40% with vague explanations of infrastructure improvements that no one could actually identify. By the end of the meeting, the community had voted to establish an independent audit committee to review all HOA financials and contracts from the past year. Susan and Doug abstained from this vote, looking increasingly uncomfortable. As the meeting adjourned, I was approached by several neighbors congratulating me for standing up to Susan. I appreciated their support, but knew this was just the beginning. Something bigger was happening behind the scenes, and my fishing spot dispute had somehow opened a Pandora's box of issues. The next morning, I was back at my spot on the dock when I noticed something strange: a surveyor taking measurements at the shoreline near our community beach. When I asked what he was doing, he informed me he was conducting preliminary site assessments for lakeside luxury condominiums. This was the first I'd heard of any development plans for our community property. According to our HOA covenant, any sale or development of common areas required a 75% vote of all homeowners, a vote that had definitely not taken place. I snapped a few photos of the surveyor and his equipment, then headed home to do some research. A quick search revealed that Lakeside Development Group had filed preliminary paperwork with the Monroe County Planning Department just 3 weeks ago, right around the time Susan had suddenly decided my fishing spot needed to be converted to a scenic viewing area. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but I needed more information. I reached out to a friend at the county clerk's office and asked if she could look into any recent filings related to our HOA or Lakeside Development Group. 2 days later, she called me back with disturbing news. "Sam, I found something you should see." There's a draft contract for the sale of approximately 2 acres of lakefront property currently owned by Lakeview Estates HOA to Lakeside Development Group for $1.2 million. My heart sank. The east end of our dock, my fishing spot, was situated on that exact parcel of land. Who signed it on behalf of the HOA? I asked, already guessing the answer. It's not fully executed yet, but the draft has signature lines for Susan Perkins as president and Douglas Matthews as treasurer. Is that even legal? Our covenant requires a homeowner vote for any sale of common property. There's a clause in the draft stating that the HOA board has certified it has the authority to execute the agreement pursuant to a special referendum. But you'd know better than I would if such a referendum took place. It most certainly had not. This explained everything: Susan's sudden interest in relocating fishermen from the East Dock, the mysterious meetings, the drained reserve fund. They were preparing to sell off our prime lakefront access for development, likely with some kickback for themselves. I thanked my friend and immediately called an emergency meeting of our newly formed Facebook group. We met that evening in Richard Garcia's spacious basement, away from the community clubhouse where Susan might get wind of our gathering. "This is fraud, plain and simple," Richard stated after I'd explained what I'd discovered. "They're falsely claiming homeowner approval for a sale that we've never even been informed about." "But why would Susan and Doug risk something like this?" asked Lisa Johnson. "They live here too. A condominium development would affect their property values just like ours." Amanda Thompson spoke up. "Actually, Susan put her house on the market last week. I noticed the sign when I was driving past. That was the final confirmation we needed. Susan was planning to cash in and get out before the development began. We need to act quickly," I said. "According to my source, they're planning to finalize the contract next week. We formulated a plan. Richard would prepare legal documentation to block the sale. Amanda, who worked in local media, would prepare a press release in case we needed public pressure. Mark Johnson, who served on the County Planning Commission, would look into whether any zoning variances had been requested. And me. I would continue fishing from my spot every day, documenting any interactions with Susan or board members, and keeping an eye on any unusual activity near the lakefront. The next morning was Saturday, and as expected, Susan appeared at the dock shortly after I'd set up my gear. This time she had brought a security guard from a private company, a blatant intimidation tactic. "Mr. Blackwell, you are trespassing in a restricted area," she announced loudly. "If you don't vacate immediately, I'll have you removed." I smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, Susan." "Lovely day, isn't it? I'm curious, when did the HOA hire private security? I don't recall seeing that expenditure in the budget reports." She ignored my question. "This is your final warning. Leave now or face the consequences." I reeled in my lines slowly and turned to face her directly. "Before you do anything rash, Susan, I think you should know that I'm aware of the planned sale to Lakeside Development Group." The color drained from her face. "I also know that no homeowner referendum has taken place, despite what the contract draft claims. That's fraud, Susan. Criminal fraud." The security guard looked uncertainly between us. "Madam, what's he talking about?" Susan composed herself quickly. "He's confused. This is an internal HOA matter." She turned back to me. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Samuel, don't I? 2 acres of lakefront property, $1.2 million, condominiums where our dock and beach currently stand. Does that sound familiar?" Susan's eyes narrowed. "You're interfering with matters beyond your understanding. The board is acting in the best interests of the community." "Then you won't mind if we put it to a vote at a properly noticed meeting," I challenged. "Full disclosure, open discussion, transparent process." "That would unnecessarily delay a time-sensitive opportunity," she said stiffly. "Opportunity for whom, Susan?" "For the community that loses its lake access. Or for you and Doug, who stand to benefit personally from this deal." The security guard was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Madam, I was just hired to enforce the no fishing rule. I don't want to get involved in anything improper." "There is nothing improper happening," Susan snapped. "Do your job or I'll find someone who will." I addressed the guard directly. "You should know that we've already alerted the county prosecutor's office to potential fraud regarding this property. You might want to consider whether you want to be associated with that." That was a bluff. We hadn't contacted the prosecutor yet, but it had the desired effect. The guard took a step back. "I think I need to clarify my assignment before proceeding," he said, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot. Susan was fuming. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Samuel. I strongly suggest you back off before things get unpleasant for you and Angela." Now she was threatening my wife. That crossed a line. "Actually, Susan, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, someone who's about to learn a hard lesson about community and accountability. Enjoy your weekend." I cast my line back into the water, effectively dismissing her. After a moment of silent rage, she stormed off, already pulling out her phone to make a call. That afternoon, we put the next phase of our plan into action. Richard filed an emergency injunction with the county court to prevent any sale of HOA property without proper homeowner approval. Amanda prepared a detailed story about potential HOA fraud and shopped it to local news outlets. Mark confirmed that Lakeside Development Group had indeed applied for zoning variances that would allow for a multi-story condominium complex on what was currently designated as recreational space. We also scheduled an emergency community meeting for Sunday afternoon, notifying every homeowner through our Facebook group, email, and door-to-door flyers. We made sure to follow every procedural requirement in the bylaws, documenting everything meticulously. Sunday's meeting was even more crowded than the previous one. We'd rented a space at the local community center to accommodate everyone. Susan and Doug didn't show up, but we had achieved quorum without them. Richard Garcia presented our findings clearly and concisely, backed up with documentation. The reaction was immediate and powerful: shock, anger, and a unified determination to stop the sale. "They've been playing us for fools," said Michael Adler, who had previously been one of Susan's supporters. "All these petty fines and rule changes were just distractions while they set up this deal." The community voted unanimously to remove Susan, Doug, and their allied board member from their positions, as permitted by our bylaws in cases of malfeasance. We elected an interim board to serve until regular elections could be held, with Richard as acting president. As the meeting concluded, my phone rang. It was Amanda. "Sam, you need to get to the dock right away," she said urgently. "Susan and some men are there with construction equipment." I raced to the lakefront, along with several others who had overheard Amanda's call. When we arrived, we found Susan supervising as workers began to dismantle the east end of the dock, my fishing spot. "Stop right there," I shouted, approaching quickly. "You have no authority to do this." Susan looked smugly confident. "I have a signed contract with these contractors. The work has been approved by the HOA board. You've just been removed from the board by a vote of the homeowners," I informed her, "and we have a court injunction preventing any alterations to community property pending investigation." I held up the court document that Richard had obtained the previous day. One of the workers examined the paper. "This looks legitimate, madam. We can't continue without clearing this up." "This is ridiculous," Susan sputtered. "You can't just remove elected board members because you disagree with their decisions." "We can when those board members are engaged in fraud," said Richard, who had arrived just behind me. "Susan Perkins, as acting HOA president, I'm informing you that we've turned over evidence to the county prosecutor regarding your attempted unauthorized sale of community property for personal gain." That wiped the smug expression from her face. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Lakeside Development would have paid the HOA handsomely for that property." "And how much would they have paid you and Doug on the side?" I asked pointedly. She didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. As the contractors packed up their equipment and left, Susan stood alone at the end of the partially dismantled dock, looking out over the lake. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The county prosecutor's office launched a formal investigation into Susan and Doug's activities. Bank records revealed that both had received consulting payments from a subsidiary of Lakeside Development Group. The draft contract included false statements about homeowner approval that could be considered wire fraud since it had been transmitted electronically. Meanwhile, our interim board began the process of rebuilding trust and transparency in the community. All financial records were made public. Meetings were live-streamed for those who couldn't attend in person, and we implemented a new system of checks and balances to prevent any future abuses of power. As for my fishing spot, the dock was repaired and improved, with a new plaque designating it as Community Fishing Area Open to All Residents. It was a small victory that symbolized a much larger one, the reclaiming of our community from those who would exploit it for personal gain. Susan and Doug both put their houses on the market and moved away before criminal charges were formally filed. However, the prosecutor's office continued their investigation, eventually bringing charges of attempted fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy against both of them. 1 year later, I sat in my usual spot on the dock, fishing pole in hand, enjoying the peaceful morning. Richard Garcia walked down to join me, carrying a thermos of coffee. "Thought you might like to know," he said as he settled onto the bench beside me. "Susan and Doug took a plea deal yesterday. Probation, community service, and restitution to the HOA for misused funds." I nodded, watching my line bob gently in the water. "Seems fair. It was never about punishing them, just about protecting our community." "And your fishing spot," Richard added with a smile. "That too," I admitted. Though I've come to realize, it represents something bigger, the idea that sometimes you have to stand up against people who abuse their authority, even when it seems like a small issue at first. Richard poured us both some coffee. Small issues have a way of revealing bigger ones. If you hadn't stood your ground that first day, who knows what might have happened? I thought about that as we sat in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Our community was stronger now, more engaged and vigilant. Attendance at HOA meetings remained high, and decisions were made transparently with genuine input from residents. My fishing spot remained my favorite place in the neighborhood, but now I often shared it with other residents, teaching kids how to cast a line, swapping fishing stories with neighbors, or sometimes just enjoying the company of friends like Richard. The lake was still there, the fish were still biting, and our community still had access to the beautiful shoreline that had drawn us here in the first place. All because I refused to give up my fishing spot to an HOA president who thought she could push people around to serve her own interests. Sometimes, standing your ground on a small issue prevents much bigger losses down the road. And sometimes, a fishing spot is more than just a place to catch fish. It's a line in the sand where you decide what kind of community you want to live in and what you're willing to do to protect it. As I reeled in a nice-sized bass that morning, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Susan Perkins and her clipboard, and how she never expected that trying to take my fishing spot would end with her criminal conviction and the complete transformation of our community. I released the bass back into the clear waters of Lake Monroe, watching it swim away toward deeper water. Just like our community, it was free now, and that made all the difference.